Welcome to the Phase Space Invaders podcast. Please make yourself comfortable. This time in episode number 19, I'm talking to Alex MacKerell, Professor of Pharmaceutical Sciences and the Director of the Computer-Aided Drug Design Center at the University of Maryland School of Pharmacy in Baltimore. In the community, Alex is famous for his contributions to the CHARMM family of atomistic force fields, including multiple innovations on the physics side, from the dihedral correlation CMAP terms that are key for accurate modeling of protein structures, to the more recent developments of the polarizable atomistic model based on the oscillating Drude particle. So whether it's the CHARMM general force field for small molecules or CHARMM 36 for biomacromolecules, you will find Alex's name all over the place, and he remains also extremely active in the field of molecular pharmacology and drug design. And so we discuss the history and future of these developments and whether Alex believes there is more physics that we need to include in our classical energy functions to work around our current challenges in biomolecular modeling. Throughout the conversation, he's advocated for a pragmatic, down-to-earth approach with the idea of big molecules, small physics. Alex also highlights the need to augment AI tools with HI, or human intelligence, arguing that so far most attempts at automating model development too much end up with parameters that are unphysical and non-transferable. Yet another interesting point is our often surprising reliance on the truly ancient experimental data. And we try to make a point that these very non-sexy physical chemistry measurements straight from the 60s and the 70s could truly advance the field if anyone was willing to fund them and actually get them done. Hope you enjoy our discussion. Okay, Alex MacKerell, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
So, Alex, you spent a good part of your impressive career working on the fundamentals of the CHARMM force field, which is considered state-of-the-art in almost any corner of biochemistry, be it glycans, membranes, polymers, ligands, and now obviously proteins and nucleic acids as well. Is there any remaining part of the chemical space that you yourself are looking forward to explore in this way?
Well, we just, from the beginning, we started with basically proteins and then to nucleic acids and so on. And then you realize we had to make a very comprehensive force field because people want to start to look at very large heterogeneous systems and so on. So we really looked towards first covering biological molecules as much as possible in a consistent fashion. So basically the proteins and the nucleic acids and the lipids, and they all could be mixed and matched and so on. And then you move into non-biological space, which is now getting into drug molecules and so on. And so this got us into the CHARMM, the CHARMM general force field. And basically we started with everything that we had done for the biologicals, made CHARMM, and then slowly sort of expanded CHARMM coverage into a wider range of chemical space. So that becomes an infinite task, essentially. Now you sort of cover the most relevant parts first, and then, when you sort of run into a problem that there's some obscure chemical connectivity that you haven't dealt with, you move into that area and so on. So this is sort of where we continue to sort of expand the additive force field and so on. And then also there's the realm of the lipids and carbohydrates, which are quite diverse in biology when you get into all the bacteria and all these different things. And so that's an area which sort of continues to be expanded. Again, slowly as people run into different problems that they're interested in and so on.
Right, there's this feeling sometimes in at least some corners of the force field development field, right, that we are getting to the limits of what you can squeeze out of the classical force field. But from the way you stated, it also seems that in many, many subfields, we're just at the beginning, right? There's this combinatorial explosion which never ends, really. So where do you think we are in this area? Is it that we're really in front of opening a Pandora's box of possible explorations, possible developments?
Well, one of the things that I've been happy to see, and this was sort of our, when we started doing these things around 1990-ish or something, was, again, this idea of a comprehensive force field. And now you're seeing people start to apply that to very large systems. I think a good example was with the pandemic. You saw these simulations of the spike protein with the bilayer and the glycans, and they were getting very interesting and very appears to be pretty accurate results with respect to conformational changes that they didn't really bake into the simulations and so on. And I think, in the context of the additive force field, this is sort of where you're going, is we're showing that we're seeing that it works very well in very large, diverse cell walls, all these sort of strange things. And that's been very satisfying to see that all these sort of little itsy bitsy things like worrying about the hydration of, percentage of hydration of methanol and so on is not perfect. But when it's been done in a way that it's all balanced out, the force fields are working quite well in these very large heterogeneous systems. And you start to see people like doing pharmacology now. It has a wing of like computational chemistry, and they're sort of getting insights in very complex systems. And I think that's great. And I think that's going to continue to move forward. And as part of that, you sort of have to add some new functionality with respect to carbohydrates, lipids, or whatever, even with proteins and nucleic acids. You have all these different modifications and these types of things. And that'll just continue to, move forward and so on.
Right. So probably we get all the low hanging fruits already, right? And now it's going to be a whole galaxy of additions. But it's impressive to think that probably a large part of medicinal chemistry relies on the tools that you've developed, right? So I know that you have been looking into using, for example, machine learning to enhance the prediction of types, the prediction of parameters. Is it where your mind is now, or is it the main way forward, or do you think we can add something else to improve those general capabilities that's just beyond standard things?
Well, yeah, we're combining ML with HL, which is human learning. And, it's like you can start to sample like broad ranges of parameter space using machine learning and going in and sort of generating a collection of data for a range of parameters, and then using that to train a machine learning model, then search through millions of parameter sets and so on. But in the end, it still gets back to making decisions about what's coming out of the models in the end. And you can really sort of get something that looks really good with respect to reproducing some sort of target data and so on. And then you sort of look under the hood and you see that the values of the parameters are sort of these unphysical values that just don't make any sense. And if you start to combine them with other things, it just wouldn't work. So, this is sort of the problem of getting into like highly automated fitting approaches, is that you sort of can use them, but then you really have to step back and see what you've done. And is it going to map out into a broader context and so on? And you can say you can keep making your machine learning models and larger and more complex and these types of things. But you're always, at least us, we still have to go back and look at, what's actually been done and then reevaluate how to maybe do the machine learning better, or maybe even sort of going on a little tangent of HL and, sort of doing some manual optimization and using our intuition and these types of things. So it's a combination of, you really have to sit down and think about the problem, collect the appropriate target data, which is very sparse. This is a big problem. And you just can't rely on quantum mechanical data because it doesn't really get you the condensed phase properties. You can sort of work around that to various degrees, but the sparseness of the experimental target data out there is a real problem. And this sort of hinders automated procedures to some extent.
Right. When it comes to automated parameterization, I've been there. I can certify that, yes, under the hood is absolutely ugly. Even if something stable comes out of it, that's very true. So do you think we might be looking into another, you pioneered some of those new ways of incorporating physics, polarization, CMAPs, system-specific combinations of Lennard-Jones parameters and so on. Do you think there's another term that we can add, that will solve many of our problems? Or is it we're close to the limits?
Yeah, I think one of the areas now that we're sort of focused on is, okay, you can always expand the energy function, right? We've now moved into the Drude polarizable force field. So we do polarization using these Drude oscillators and so on. Now you can start to get, charge transfer, things like that, which makes the model more complex and so on. One of our general philosophies has been to generally just sort of get to a form of the energy function, and we're going to stay there and we're going to expand the coverage. And this is what we did with the additive force field to get a really expanded coverage that allows people to do these heterogeneous systems like we talked about before. And with the Drude force field, we're sort of doing the same type of thing. Now, in the context of a given form of the energy function, one of the big approximations are the combining rules for the van der Waals interactions. And we're typically we stay with the Leonard-Jones formalism for all of its, its good points and its bad points and so on. But the combining rules are a severe approximation. And one of the things we're working on is just bringing in more explicit parameterization of the different atom type interactions. This gets back to the pair-specific Leonard-Jones and sort of expanding on that, because I think that's an area where you can get a lot of improvements in the context of the same form of the energy function. And, there you can start to use large scale quantum mechanical calculations of like large numbers of interacting pairs, automating that and using that as target data to sort of fill like the off diagonal Leonard-Jones terms, which are the terms that you have to calculate using the combining rules and so on. So I think that's a big area for we can improve in the context of the current energy functions. And we found that it's more important with the polarizable force field, because when you have the electronic polarization effects, basically, the electronic structure and principle changes as a function of environment. And so this makes the relationship of your van der Waals term and your electrostatic terms even a little bit more sensitive than in the additive force field, when the charges are never changing or anything. And so we found that we have to be a little bit more careful with the polarizable force field with respect to the treatment of the Leonard-Jones term. And then using these, looking at pair-specific interactions is quite important. And we're trying to automate that as much as possible. But again, you get back to the problem of the quantum mechanics that only takes you so far and so on. But, we've more recently done some work with like ions, optimizing specific parameters for the Leonard-Jones term between ions and the range of functional groups, the biological molecules, drugs, and so on. And that's an area we're working in that.
Right. It's funny to think that a lot of artifacts can be actually caused by ions, right? We often think that, it's just the internal terms within a macromolecule or something. And then you realize, there's an ion chelating something or staying in a strange position, especially with magnesium, or there's ions that are more problematic.
Yeah. And this is, with the polarizable force fields, your solutes, whatever, your protein, your nucleic acid is much more sensitive to the ionic environment, much more than the additive force field. We're seeing that. And that requires more care and so on. And it also requires proper treatment of the ion environment. Now, you have specific interactions, like RNA with magnesium at a specific site and these types of things and so on. But then just getting the distribution of the ions around nucleic acid or protein needs to be done carefully, which is largely using big systems. So you can have basically your nucleic acid, which is a polyanion. Then you've got the counter ions around it, but then you have to have the co-ions beyond the counter ions to sort of get a proper balance for the counter ions to go towards the nucleic acid versus going back out into solution and so on. So you have to start simply doing simulations on systems that are larger to get a full ionic environment. And we find that that's more important, especially with the polarizable force field, to sort of get these more subtle aspects of ion biomolecular interactions better.
Right. And as you mentioned before, there's also always the question of availability of good quality data, right? Because things like positions and occupancies of ion binding sites are notoriously hard to determine with high precision, especially when the conditions of the experiment are often extreme or strange.
Yeah, I mean, like sodium in the grooves of DNA is still somewhat controversial, right?
Yeah. How do you measure that? Exactly. So what's the driving force on the experimental side that you think might help us here? Do you think it's just coming out of structures or like some specific techniques that you see that's helping a lot? Or
the stuff that would really help is the stuff no one wants to do. And this is back to hydration-free energies of a wide range of chemical space, and somebody experimentally measuring those pure solvent properties of, a wider range of molecules. Things like osmotic pressure of much wider range of ions and different types of functional groups. Like, give me dimethyl phosphate with a range of group 1 ions, osmotic pressures for those, and we could, really sort of know what we're doing versus we're sort of grasping at like there's sodium with acetate, and, potassium with dimethyl phosphate. And you're sort of looking at these little spaces where this is this idea of sparse data where you find the pieces that you can work with, and you then sort of try to come up with an algorithm that says, okay, if I use this approach, I get something that gives me condensed phase properties. And then you start applying it to other ions and things like that. And you're hoping that it works. You just don't know. And then you sort of have to do simulations, and you sort of look at what you're getting and say, well, that seems reasonable, or it doesn't seem reasonable, but I have the data to really compare it to. So this is sort of in the end, if everything's like salt, salts coming out of solution is probably not a good, good force field, these type of things. But you don't know the details of like what the exact osmotic pressure should be. So you sort of say, okay, it looks good. Go from there.
Yeah, no, I've definitely seen myself, look into papers from 1967 or something like that, trying to read from
20s,
the strange.
It's like, They did some good stuff back in the 20s. I mean, this gets to,
from a scan of an old graph, you're reading all these pressures. And then, for example, you see there's a discrepancy with a factor of 2 between the paper from 67 and 72, and the authors are already dead. So how do you even make sure that they didn't make a mistake?
Yeah. It's just the accuracy of the experimental method. I mean, this is one of the things too, is just like computational people look at experimental data and as like, this is absolutely correct. And oftentimes it's like, well, probably not correct. And especially when you start to look at, a range of properties and it's summary, this is really strange. And sometimes you have to say maybe the experiments are just not,
Yeah. So maybe there's a point in us computational people who know what the needs are, running mini physical chemistry labs, right? And generating our own data for those particular purposes. I don't think that would be actually complicated if it was doable in the 70s, but as you say, for some reason, nobody wants to repeat those things.
Well, nobody, you got to pay for it too. And this is like, you go to a funding agency and you're saying, I'm going to do osmotic pressures of a bunch of these things. And oftentimes they're like, well, that's not really exciting. So we're not going to fund that. And, and people's interest too. It's just like, again, it's the physical chemists who are really into like looking at things like osmotic pressures and so on. So you have to find people who are interested in doing that type of work and these types of things. So it's, there's a funding issue, there's an interest issue.
Right. We're going to put it out there. So if anyone wants to cite this podcast as a reason that there is a community interest in getting this funded, here it is. Yeah. So that's one thing. And then the other thing I wanted to talk about is your famous fondness of protocols, right? Because I even had Justin Lemkel on this podcast before, and we joked about your famous sayings about how protocols essentially make the field go forward, right? In a way that's reproducible and so on. And I think what you have in the CHARMM GUI server now is a great example of how you could get reproducibility out of this standardization of workflows, right? What is your
this
philosophy?
Obviously one pill M is the king of the CHARMM GUI. It was sort of a great visit on his part. And then it was great because, we knew each other well. And so we were able to sort of help, sort of put those standards in there. And yes, it's very important to have truncation methods, the types of the ensembles you're generating and so on. Make sure that they're consistent. And the force field is somewhat dependent on what truncation scheme you use and so on, especially with anisotropic systems such as bilayers and so on. So yes, that has been important in getting consistency into the field. And again, I think it's worked out well because, people can go into the CHARMM GUI. They can, One Pill and all his coworkers have put in great tools to like make these complex systems, but then they know that what they're coming out and then how they're simulating them with respect to cutoff schemes and all these types of things are well thought out and you're going to get the best behavior out of the underlying force field that's being used. So yeah, I mean, just being very systematic is just essential.
Yeah, it's also true that there's a big lag time in terms of adopting best practices, right? And something comes out in the literature that, now this is the go-to thermostat or the go-to setting of the cutoff distance. And then it takes people 5 or 10 years to update their MDP files in Chromax or run input files in other softwares, right? So yeah, I think if you could accelerate this, it's great.
A good example of that was the LJPME generated by Eric Lindahl and coworkers. And I mean, it's great, okay, because it's a long range treatment of dispersion. It's rigorous. It's nice because you can now use a shorter real space cutoff for both your electrostatics and your Leonard-Jones terms, which gives you a speed up. You got the extra overhead for the FFTs and so on, but you still get like a 25% speed up going from 12 to 9 angstroms and so on. And I visited Eric Lindahl in Sweden pre-pandemic, and they just come out with this, and they're like, why isn't everybody using it? It's like, well, the force fields aren't optimized for that. We had to go back working with like Rich Pasteur, Jeff Clouda, and others to like re-optimize the parameters for the lipids, because the lipids are particularly sensitive to that and so on. And then once you've done that, then you can start to use LJPME. And in addition, you've got to get people to put LJPME in other codes besides GROMACS, right? And this is a force field or whatever. People have to support it, right? You need to have force field supported in OpenMM and CHARMM and AMD and GROMACS and so on. And those logistics just take time for people to implement, test, and then put things to wider use. Yeah.
Right. I believe it was the same with things like CMAP, right? When you introduce a correction into one software, then it takes half a decade for everyone else to install it implement it into the code. That's a big consideration for people doing things that are out of the box. So I mean, it's really cool that we have this pathway to shorten it.
Yeah. I mean, again, people have to, get on board, and it's like, okay, the force field's sort of like halfway done, and then convincing people to sort of implement that in their code, to spend the time to do that, is always hard. I mean, with the Drude polarizable force field, we had it in CHARMM, and then Klaus Schulten moved ahead and implemented it in AMD, and CHARMM's a little slow compared to AMD and these other codes and so on. So that was very helpful because it allowed us to start to do a lot more testing and so on using AMD, in addition to the work we were doing with CHARMM. And so, and he knew the force field wasn't ready yet for prime time, but he's like, let's get this in there because it's going to be useful. And that really facilitated our development of the force field and so on. And then later on, OpenMM, others have adopted like the Drude polarizable force field. Yeah, that's part of the game.
We've seen many cases in which great things come out of having just a big user base, right? Where people just figure out what the problems are and they share that and people go back to fix it. I think there's also now this huge initiative. It's actually many groups in parallel, including ours in Barcelona, of having repositories for trajectories. So if people can have consistently generated trajectories, that's also going to improve a lot the reproducibility of, say, in the context, for example, of training, machine learning models on trajectories, if they are generating with the same setups, the same parameter sets, and so on.
Yeah, people have sort of been pushing that for years. It's logistically very difficult. And it's someone has to support, obviously, a resource that's going to be able to store tons of data and make it accessible, and people are going to have to be continuing to manage it and so on. It's sort of like the protein database on steroids. It's just, it's great to say it. Doing it is going to be hard, and, we're supportive of any, activities. But yeah, having all that data stored with, that the long range interactions are treated well and force fields consistent, all these types of things will be hugely useful.
Yeah, unfortunately, as a community, we're no Google to have like a big data storage facility in the middle of Nevada or somewhere. But yeah, I think this is like a lot of nice outcomes are going to come out of this. So there's nice convergence of all those things, from protocols to cross-supported algorithms and physical terms, right, to databases.
Exactly. I mean, it's, Google and stuff does amazing things, but they've commercialized parts of their technology, which allows them to do other things. And, this is one of the things, is like, how do you get the finances to support these? And governments will support it to a certain extent for a certain period of time. But that's the big problem is, do you commercialize things? Can you commercialize something like a database like that can be useful, that someone wants to pay to, get access to the data, commercial interests, and then that can then support maintenance, which makes it accessible to academic people at low or no charge. And that's a difficult model to do for a lot of academic projects and so on.
That's true. I mean, our biggest promise is probably that we will deliver rationally designed medicines of the future, right? But that doesn't materialize at the rate that we would like to see.
Yeah, it's never fast enough.
It's a tough sell for the governments.
But then you have the materials world and all these places. It's like, can we sort of add more to that? And like you said, it's just like, mix that in with the, all the AI developments and allow, because AI becomes it's a data log, and, can physical models, large trajectory be the source for AI development and so on. And
it's exciting to think that we'll have all this data, as you say, to improve. To repeat what you say, we probably don't need exciting physics there, right? We can just use data to improve the physics that we have in ways that we understand.
Yeah, it's like big molecule, small physics is sort of what I like to say. It's, and you can do a lot with small physics. I mean, again, the Leonard Jones 612, people beat on it a lot, but it's sort of taken us pretty far.
That's a great takeaway message, I think. So,
yeah.
Alex MacKerell, thanks so much for the conversation. It was a pleasure.
Yeah, I enjoyed myself. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thanks a lot and have a great day.
Thank you for listening. See you in the next episode of Face Space Invaders.